Hey everyone, welcome to the Bread of Life channel. I'm here with Chad, and we're going to be discussing biblical roadblocks to Christianity. And this is Chad's title that he came up with, and I'm actually not sure about everywhere that, all the roadblocks that we're going to talk about. Chad, do you want to just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Well, I'm Chad. I live in Colorado. I worked in biotech recently, but I'm going back to school for radiology. My hobbies are playing guitar and writing music, and I'm also really interested in philosophy and theology and Christianity particularly.
Cool. And for those, if you want to hear Chad's music, please, there's a link in the description that has his music. So check that out. It's really cool. Hi, Travis. I'm glad you're here. Thank you for being here, even though Pine Creek is live. I was really upset when I saw that. But of course, that's the way it goes. But I'm really excited about this conversation. Actually, I've been looking forward to it all week. So, what was there was something else we needed to, anyway, where do you want to go with this, Chad? What are the biblical roadblocks?
Okay. Well, let's see. Let's start with, one of the things we were going to talk about, I think, is the atonement. And so what I'd like to do is choose one that's related to the atonement, but also I think we'll touch a little bit on our first discussion that we had about animal suffering, because in that discussion I was raising mainly philosophical objections, but I think there are actually biblical objections that could be raised as well against the position you were putting forward, which is that when the end times or when everything is made right, the animal suffering will be done away with as well, and death of that kind. So I think what the first place to go would be Ezekiel's vision of the restoration of Israel, and it's chapters 40 through 48. Now, we're not going to read through all 8 chapters, but I'm just curious, how familiar are you with those chapters? I'm sure you've read them before.
Well, I mean, I probably haven't read Ezekiel this year, so I've read it a bunch of times, but is this okay? It looks like this is where he describes the like rebuilt temple.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I think the best place to start might be chapter 43.
Okay.
And this is just one of many passages in the Hebrew Bible which talk about a future temple and future temple sacrifices. But let's start at chapter 43, verse 6. I'll read from the NIV.
Okay.
It says, while the man was standing beside me, I heard someone speaking to me from inside the temple. He said, "Son of man, this is the place of my throne and the place for the soles of my feet. This is where I will live among the Israelites forever. The people of Israel will never again defile my holy name, neither they nor their kings, by their prostitution and the funeral offerings for their kings at their death. When they placed their threshold next to my threshold and their doorpost beside my doorpost, with only a wall between me and them, they defiled my holy name and their detestable practices, so I destroyed them in my anger. Now let them put away from their prostitution and funeral offerings for their kings, and I will live among them forever. Son of man, describe the temple." By the way, some people might not know that Ezekiel is actually called the Son of Man. I know that term is commonly understood as referring to Jesus in the New Testament, but I think in the Old Testament, or at least in certain places, it just means a person, a man. Son of man, describe the temple to the people of Israel, that they may be ashamed of their sins. Let them consider its perfection, and if they're ashamed of all they've done, make known to them the design of the temple, its arrangements, its exits, its entrances, its whole design and all its regulations and laws. Write these down before them so that they may be faithful to its design and follow all its regulations. And then it says, this is the law of the temple. All the surrounding area on top of the mountain will be most holy. Such is the law of the temple. And it talks here about the next section. The headers for the next section is the great altar restored. And I think now, why don't we skip a couple chapters ahead to chapter 45?
Okay.
Interestingly, if you read the New Testament, it's pretty clear, I think, in certain places like Acts 17, I think it said, or Acts 7, says that God does not live in temples made by human hands. And there's a similar idea in Revelation. So I think there's a bit of a conflict here, where the New Testament sees the temple as something that was kind of a shadow of what was to come. It was not really meant to be, it was never meant to be the final solution to sin, at least according to what we read in the New Testament, because Jesus's death on the cross was, as Paul calls, a once for all sacrifice for sin. But I think we're seeing a very different picture here in Ezekiel, because this is his vision of the final restoration. This is what, this hasn't been fulfilled yet. Now, if you went to chapter 45, if we go down to verse 22, this entire chapter is basically, well, the first part starts off with giving the temple dimensions and the dimensions of the Holy Land surrounding it. Gives all of these very specific measurements, 25,000 cubits long, 10,000 cubits wide. So it's very clear here that this is not something that's to be taken metaphorically, as many Christians try to do. But it seems clear to me, at least, that it's meant to be taken literally. And then after round,
can I pause you for a minute?
Yeah, sure.
I meant to ask you, what is your religious background?
Oh, well, I grew up in a Christian household. My mom was, maybe we should have started with that. I don't know.
I meant to, but I lost my train of thought, and I just couldn't get back. I forgot to ask you.
That's okay.
So.
I grew up in a Christian home. My mom was Presbyterian. My dad's secular. So ever since I was a kid, I think I believed when I was first taught it as a child, but I always had doubts. I mean, I think my first experience of ever doubting anything, I think, was when I remember my sister and I were sitting in the back seat, and we were probably like 8 years old, something like that, and my mom just like laid the entire like worldview of Christianity at us, and it just kind of floored me. Like, I was just like, whoa, that's the world we live in. It kind of shocked me, but I did believe it for a long time. And over time, I mean, I think praying and not really getting any answers sort of pushed me in the other direction. In my teen years, I sort of fell away from it. And around maybe 2012, 2013, I started getting an interest in the question of God again. And that sort of led me back into reading the Bible. And I developed a real keen interest in the Bible that I never had before, not just from a historical perspective or a psychological perspective, but, knowing people in my personal life who have what they would describe as such a real relationship with God, like my mom especially. Instilled this desire in me to understand what's going on. What is it that is happening with people like yourself as well? Like, there's clearly something, whether it's God communicating with you or whether it's something psychological. I want to understand what it is. And so I think that that was a major factor that got me interested in the Bible and still has me interested in the Bible.
Cool.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, so back to Ezekiel.
Okay. So
45.
after around verse 7, it starts going into all of the laws that God is saying they're going to be subject to in this new age. It talks about, the temple rituals and the festivals that they'll have to observe, and all of these specific regulations that they're going to have to observe. And I think this is what I personally think is one of the most damning verses for Christianity in the entire Hebrew Bible, is Ezekiel chapter 45, verse 22. It says, "On that day, the prince is to provide a bull as a sin offering for himself and for all the people of the land." So there are many problematic aspects to this. First of all, there's this issue of who is the prince. If we read Ezekiel, I think it's chapter 36, there are strong indications that the prince is the Messiah, or it's supposed to be the future Messiah. It's clearly somebody who's in a position of leadership. And so when we see this verse here, the prince is to provide a bull offering as a sin offering for himself. Well, if Jesus is the Messiah and if Jesus is sinless, why would he need to bring a bull as a sin offering for himself? If the Messiah was supposed to be sinless, why would he have to do that? Now, there are various arguments that some people will raise against the idea that the prince is the Messiah. And it's not, I wouldn't claim that it's definitive, though I would think, you know, if you're just reading Ezekiel for what it says, I think that most people would come away with that impression that it is the Messiah. But I think a bigger problem here is just this issue of how do we reconcile this with New Testament theology in general? Because if Jesus was a once for all sacrifice for sin, why would there need to be any future atonement made through animal sacrifice? One of the things that people will claim to sort of get out of this is they'll say that, well, these sacrifices are just a memorial that point back to Jesus, similar to how the old covenant sacrifices were intended to point forward to Jesus. But it says very clearly here that this is a sin offering for himself and all the people of the land. Sin offerings are not memorials. They're not, I mean, you could debate about whether they're symbolic, but they're intended for the purpose of making atonement. And it says several times in this chapter, I'll just point out the three references where it actually mentions atonement. It says in verse 15, second part of verse 15, these will be used for the grain offerings, burnt offerings, and fellowship offerings to make atonement for the people, declares the sovereign Lord. Verse 17, we'll just read the end of the verse because it's kind of long. Grain offerings, burnt offerings, and fellowship offerings to make atonement for the Israelites. Verse 20, you're to do the same on the seventh day of the month for anyone who sins unintentionally through ignorance. So you are to make atonement for the temple, right? And this is one of many passages in the Bible which talk about this. I think it's probably the most explicit, but there are at least 5 or 6 other references in the Hebrew Bible which talk about these future sacrifices. And so I think it makes, in my opinion, this makes perfect sense on the hypothesis that this wasn't inspired by a God whose plan of salvation from the very beginning was to send the Messiah to die as a once for all sacrifice for sin. This seems to make a lot more sense on the idea that that this is Ezekiel's, this is Ezekiel writing about what he understands God's plan of salvation is going to be, and it's informed entirely by the culture in which he lived. And so I guess I'll turn it over to you now and get your thoughts on how you make sense of this, what you think's going on here.
Well, I don't make sense of it. And this is where I will tell you my eschatology is a little bit of a mess because, there are passages like this. I think there's another one in Isaiah, that kind of speak about this restored temple. And, there's other issues with eschatology that are not settled. So I would say in theology, the place that I'm the most unsettled is eschatology. And so I do think there's a lot of issues like this that I really can't point to and say, I understand what's going on here. I do think, there are some Christians who, would say that, well, because there is going to be a rebuilt temple in Jerusalem, not that it is God, that is the ultimate, but there will be a restoration of Jewish sacrifices and stuff like that. But that this is going to ultimately point to the Messiah. And then, we're going to have this, period where the people of Israel recognize Christ as the Messiah. So, does that offer a solution for you? Maybe not. But, I'm just content on things like this to just say, you know what, I don't know.
Yeah, and that's kind of, I've heard sort of answers like that from you before when people will raise various objections. And that's part of the reason I kind of wanted to have this discussion is I want to understand why it doesn't bother you so much.
How is it okay to not know? Yeah.
Like if I knew somebody, like if there was something I was absolutely certain of, then I could perhaps like set aside evidence, little things that weigh against my position on an issue.
Right.
But is it that you feel that your relationship with God is so strong, or what is it that makes you just kind of brush this aside and say, well, what makes you content with not having an answer here?
Yeah, I would say it is because of my relationship with God, and because I believe the story as a whole. So, so while I would say, okay, I don't see how this fits into the picture with Jesus, but when I look at the Bible as a whole from Genesis to Revelation, I do see Jesus throughout the scripture, in so many places throughout scripture. So, um, you know, that helps. And then, of course, the words of Jesus, the teaching of Jesus, the sacrifice, and, everything that is presented in the New Testament, that is kind of what I look at and say, wow, this is true. And then, having the experience of the story is true, plus years of experiencing the truth of the story. So that's why this kind of, it doesn't bother me. There's lots of questions that I would not have the answer to. So
could you give me an example of like experiencing the truth of the story, or what you mean by that?
Well, I mean, I would just say a lot of times just reading the text and saying like, wow, like this story is perfect. Like God has the perfect plan. And so, and then just experiencing who Jesus is and how, the beautiful answers that he gives, the way that he describes reality, the whole idea of God coming in the flesh and giving himself for the life of the world. Like these are the things that I never, the ideas that I never tire of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I kind of get that to an extent, because I've spent, back when I lived in San Diego, I had the Mormons would come to my door a lot. I don't know why, but I spent a lot of time talking with them and researching things pertaining to Mormonism, and looking into things that are kind of similar in this respect, where I'll look at like the thousands of changes that were made to the Book of Mormon after Joseph Smith supposedly translated it. And I'll bring up or I'll look at like blatant contradictions between Mormon theology and what's written in the Old Testament. And I'll bring this up to them, and thinking that it's going to do something to kind of sway them or make them second guess a little bit. Not that that's my goal here in this discussion. But I would do that, and they would respond with very similar answers, where I think it's kind of like the perfection or beauty that they see in the story. They really, they find the idea of God, of Jesus coming and visiting the Native Americans very appealing and very beautiful. And that kind of supersedes any kind of intellectual objection that somebody could raise. And I'm curious, when you see people doing that, or if you see people doing that in other religions or denominations that you don't subscribe to, do you ever think to yourself that this person's being a little bit, I don't know if I want to say irrational, but they're not valuing the evidence as much as they should? Or do you kind of think, well, I understand where they're coming from because I do it too?
Well, and since we just moved to Salt Lake City, I'm living among many Mormons, and I love them. And I'll say the prayer that's in my heart for them is that their faith may not fail. And so when what I think of when I think of Mormons is they have a beautiful faith. And I pray that when they discover, the more and more that they discover hey, Joseph Smith isn't all he was cracked up to be, and the golden plates, there's no good evidence for them. I pray that their faith may not fail. So I hope that their experience with God is enough to keep their faith strong. Of course, I hope that they will actually, and I believe many of them do have a true revelation of Jesus Christ, as Savior. And I pray that they would grow in truth. And so I wouldn't mind if some of the other stuff, I wouldn't mind if they stopped believing in the golden plates, but they kept their faith in Christ. But I would rather them keep their faith in the golden plates and have faith in Jesus Christ than to say it's all fake. So that's my main prayer for them, is that their faith would not fail.
And what it would mean for their faith to fail is for them to be too far from God for salvation or something like that. Is that what?
No, to give up on their experience with God, to give up on God, and to give up on the core ideas about Jesus Christ. And of course, I reckon they are not Orthodox Christian, but if you've watched my channel any at all, you probably have seen that I take a very nuanced approach to religion. I believe very much that people experience God in spite of misinformation. So I think people are experiencing God all over the world, and they have a mix of true information about God and false information about God. But the information, God is not primarily concerned with everyone getting all the correct information. God is working with people. He's communicating with people. He's bringing people to himself, even when they don't have all the correct information. And if God waited to work with me, if he waited to communicate with me until I had perfect theology, I would have no experience with him. If he waited until Mormons got perfect theology, then he would be still waiting. So God works with the faith that we have.
Yeah. Okay. And that makes sense. And I understand that for you, whether they have all the correct beliefs is of secondary importance to these more fundamental considerations, right? But don't you think, like, when they ignore things that blatantly point against the truth of their religion, that do you at least think that it would be conducive to truth seeking on their part if they were to put less of a priority on the way they feel about the stories, and more of a priority on what points to the truth or falsity of the stories that they believe in?
I think in general, that's a good principle to follow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, that's kind of how I try to think when I'm reading the Bible, is whatever verse I'm coming upon. I think, does this make sense given the theological framework that's put forward by Christianity or Judaism? And is it more likely, if it's true, if I'm looking at a particular prophecy or something, and I think, for example, we had a brief dialogue before on Micah 5, where I was making a point about how, this is a prophecy that people will commonly cite as predicting Jesus's birthplace in Bethlehem. And then you just read a couple verses later and it starts talking about how he's going to be ruling the land of Assyria with a sword, how he'll be their peace when the Assyrians invade their land. And it's like, it seems to me like if we care about whether this stuff is true, we should find a way to reconcile that and not just say, oh, I don't know. And to your credit, you did say you'd look into it. And that's one of the things I appreciate about you. But
yeah. And I did look into that. And, some commentators will say that, it's, this is referring to Hezekiah. They'll say part of it is messianic, part of it's, Hezekiah. But I agree with you that as a whole, if you take all of this, it doesn't seem to completely fit. Parts of it could fit Hezekiah, Parts of it could be messianic. Parts of it, parts of it seem like it's at the end, so there's so it doesn't seem like that could fit Hezekiah. So it's kind of a mess. But the way that I kind of think about the messianic prophecies and this kind of thing, and I don't think the messianic prophecies are that strong for like proving Jesus is the Messiah. And I know that's really popular. And I think there are some, like Isaiah 53, I think see that as a clear picture of Christ. But I know there's other interpretations for that. But, like the way that I see the prophetic books is that there's like a flowing in and out. Like they're kind of like, they're having little pieces of messianic stuff intermixed with what's going on, and that makes it kind of messy for us. But maybe that has more to do with what we expect culturally and what we're used to with literature.
Yeah, well, I know exactly what you're talking about because I see it all the time when you'll look at, for example, like Isaiah 7 and 7:14, where it like contextually it doesn't fit at all with Jesus, but then they'll say, well, parts of it like the part about verse 14 about how where it says God will bring, or I'll bring the king of Assyria, that was for their own day, but then the child being born, that was for thousands of years later. And it seems to me like what's happening here is that people are engaged in some hermeneutical backflips to try and make this fit a preconceived conclusion. Because if you were reading like what you just said, maybe we're introducing our own like cultural biases or whatever. I don't know if that's exactly what you meant, but I mean, think about how people would understand it back within the context in which it was written. Would anybody remotely expect this to Isaiah 7:14 to be a prophecy about the Messiah? I mean, it just doesn't seem like, or Micah 5, for example, I think they probably would have seen as a prophecy about the Messiah. It just didn't seem to happen the way it was written. And so what it looks like people are doing is they're trying to find a way to make it fit. So they'll draw these arbitrary boundaries between verses and say, this verse is for that time and this other verse is for today's time. But there's no exegetical basis for that. It's just something that it's a construct that the person is imposing on the text in order to make it support what they want to believe. And so, and I appreciate that you don't really, at least you seem to see the flaws in that methodology. You're not the kind of person who will go around claiming that there's 300 plus prophecies about Jesus in the Bible, because you can look at those. I find it interesting how different Christians will look at these prophecies differently. Like you can look at those and see them for what they are, but other people will look at them and think, oh my God, there's 300 prophecies about Jesus and they're all fulfilled to a T. Like it's interesting how different people read the text, but yeah, I don't know. I want to throughout our conversations, I want to better understand, why these things don't bother you. And I'm getting a little bit of a picture of that.
Yeah.
And I think to really understand it, I have to understand why you believe in the first place. And I've listened to enough of your streams to know that I think one of the things you've said is that the beauty of the beauty of the stories is that is a big factor for you. And so
it's the best explanation of reality. I mean, when I think about, what answers the big questions that people have in life, I think this story does. I think, this is the best explanation for what I experience in the world. So it makes sense in a way that other things don't. So that's one reason. But there was something else I wanted to say about the prophecy thing. But I guess, one of the reasons that I think, and I mean, this might not help you at all. Okay. But one of the things that I think God was doing through the prophets is that he was revealing some things, but he also had to be careful not to reveal too much to the powers of darkness, because otherwise they would not crucify the Lord of glory. So, in some way, Satan and the powers of darkness were deceived about who Jesus was, right? They did not understand what was happening. They did understand some things. They knew he was the Son of God, but they did not understand fully what was happening here. So, I think that may be one of the reasons that, we get little bits and pieces of, it through the prophets. Another thing is that in my experience with prophecy, because, God is still speaking today. He still, speaks through people. My husband is very prophetic, and my husband doesn't always get complete pictures of things, but he will get, he'll get an image in his mind. And so I think a lot of, times the prophets themselves didn't quite have a full picture of what was going on. Now, this one with Ezekiel, this is pretty detailed. So it kind of doesn't, that one's an issue. I have to admit, I don't understand what all these dimensions are, where this is coming from. But yeah.
Yeah, there are a couple things you said there. One I want to put a pin in, and that's, you talked about how you see it as the best explanation. So I'd like to, without getting too philosophical, I'd like to kind of explore your criteria by which you judge what is a good or best explanation. But also, I'd kind of like to explore what you said about how God didn't want to reveal too much information to the prophets because otherwise the Jews wouldn't have killed Jesus.
No, not the Jews. I said the powers of darkness, the spiritual beings, the Satan, and the demonic forces that were involved. It has nothing to do with people.
Okay.
It has to do with the spiritual entities that are working against God.
Now, if I understand correctly, the spiritual entities have insight into things that human beings don't, right? Like, so for example, in Acts 16, maybe, don't quote me on that, there's a woman who's receiving knowledge of the future from a demon and things like that. So it seems like the powers of darkness already have insight into things that don't have to be it's not like God has to reveal it to a human being and the human being has to impart that information verbally or something, and the spirit hears it. It seems like they already have insight into the future. So wouldn't they have had insight into Jesus' death or his means, the way in which he would die? But also, I would like to explore why it is that Jesus needed to have been killed by the powers of darkness as opposed to just God himself. Does the atonement that Jesus made on the cross, would that have been nullified if God had been the one to crucify Jesus or kill Jesus as opposed to the powers of darkness? Those are two questions there. Sorry. We're having like two conversations at once here.
Yeah, well, when we're talking about who killed Jesus, I mean, that's a complicated question, right? Because we know it was the will of God for Jesus to die. We do know that, human beings had a part in this. The Jewish leaders turned Jesus over to be crucified. The Romans crucified him. Jesus said, no one takes my life from me. I lay it down. So in that way, Jesus had a hand in his own death. And so we know that Satan entered Judas, so he had a role in it. So there were a lot of roles involved with crucifying Jesus. But I was just offering that as a suggestion that God doesn't reveal all of his plans. And he may have reasons for that, because maybe it wouldn't go through. I mean, so,
I understand the force of that objection or that reasoning if there was some reason why Jesus would need to die in that particular way. But it's not as though God doesn't have the power to incarnate Jesus and kill him without any of that stuff, without any of this contingent chain of events taking place, right? So I guess it kind of prompts the question for me as to why it needed to happen that way in the first place. It seems like God could have just given a lot more detailed information so that the Jews could recognize the Messiah, make the prophecies a lot more impressive. And then, if it turns out that the people don't want to kill Jesus for that reason, well, God can just do it himself.
Yeah. Well, this, and I think this kind of hits on a fundamental difference between the way that you're seeing God's role in the world and the way that I see God's role in the world. Because, I see that the way God has set up the world is that he does not control all things and intervene whenever he wants. He can intervene, but he has set up the world and given it to humans to govern. And so we ask him to intervene. We ask him, please intervene here. And so I think it is God. He is working through human beings, and yes, he will intervene and use his power when we request it. But it's not God. He didn't set up things for him to control everything. So he's actually given us real power and other beings real power. He doesn't yank back that power every time we misuse it. So I do think God has limitations with what he can accomplish. Now, he's still the most powerful actor in the universe, but it doesn't mean that he just does whatever he wants all the time.
Yeah, well, it's not clear to me how what I'm proposing would involve more intervention than the plan of salvation that's described in the New Testament, right? Because there's all it would really involve is, in fact, God wouldn't even have to do it himself. Like you were just saying, he could move somebody else to do it, to kill Jesus, right? It would really be it would just be two things: incarnating Jesus on earth and having him killed. I mean, there's a lot more intervention that's described in the Bible than just those two things. So it's not clear to me how that would involve more intervention, or that God is like, doing every little thing all the time. But maybe I missed something of what about what you were saying. I don't know.
Well, I guess I just don't see like the problem with the way that he did do it.
Well, the problem is, look at how few Jews recognized the Messiah. I mean, it seems like God wanted his chosen people to know who the Savior was, and the people who were most informed on the Hebrew Bible were the least likely to accept the Messiah as their Lord and Savior. Now, that could have been avoided if he had given more clear information about what the Messiah was going to do, what he was going to be like. If he had given prophecies that are actually comprehensible within their historical context. But it sounds like you're saying, well, no, the reason he didn't do that is because he didn't want to give away too much information, because then the powers of darkness would foresee what would happen and try to stop it or something like that. But I guess the problem, as I see it, is that his chosen people, he chose to inspire the Bible in such a way that the Jews would not recognize the Messiah. They would be expecting somebody very different than who showed up. Now, maybe you don't see that as a problem, but I guess in light of my understanding of what God's motivations and goals are, it seems like it would be a problem, but maybe that's just my lack of understanding.
Well, did they not recognize the Messiah because he didn't fit the prophecies? Or did they not recognize the Messiah because their hearts were hard? So when Jesus was talking to the, religious leaders, I mean, those were the people that he was the most hard on. And he said, you diligently search the scriptures, thinking that in them you have life. But these are the scriptures that talk about me, but you refuse to come to me. And so, from my perspective, I understand that, from an outsider's perspective, okay, that sounds like, okay, well, they didn't believe, so we just made up all this stuff. Their hearts were hard. But, from, if I take Jesus's word seriously, the problem wasn't that, he wasn't fulfilling enough prophecies. It was that their hearts were hard. They did not recognize God in the flesh. I mean, this is somebody going around doing miracles and, teaching as, somebody who had authority. So I don't think the problem with the hardness was the lack of, clarity on the scripture. I think it was hardness of heart.
Yeah, and that's absolutely the picture you would come to if you're taking Jesus's words as fact. But I think that's it's an interesting question you're raising. Was it hardness of heart on the part of the Jews, or was it a lack of clarity in the scriptures? And let's explore that a little bit. Let's think about it. So,
okay.
I mean, if it is hardness of heart, I think we have some questions that need to be answered. Why is that hardness of heart so endemic to the people who were most familiar with the Hebrew Bible? Because if it is the case that the reason they didn't accept the Messiah is because of what's written in the Hebrew Bible, that would make sense as an explanation, right? Because they are the ones who are the most familiar with the Hebrew Bible. We would expect it to, if it was the case that Jesus really genuinely did not fit the bill for what's prophesied in the Hebrew Bible, what we would expect to see is exactly what happened. The Jews who are most familiar with the prophecies and what it says about the times in which the Messiah would come would for the most part not accept him, and the people who are least familiar, who are not familiar with that stuff, would accept him because they're basing their judgment on other considerations. So what would you say? And Paul does touch on this in Romans 11, but I don't think he gives a very good explanation. Why is it that the hardness of heart was so confined to a particular group of people? Wouldn't we expect it to be kind of averaged out? Like some people are hard-hearted, some people aren't. What do you think about that?
Well, the problem, Chad, is with all of humanity. But in particular, it does seem that, what's wrong with my camera? That religious people have a tendency to get off track. And so I don't think you need to take Jesus's words seriously to see what was going on with the religious leaders. All you have to do is take the Hebrew Bible seriously. Because throughout the Hebrew Bible, sorry, I'm going to try to fix my camera here. Okay, there we go. Throughout the Hebrew Bible, you have God complaining about the people's hardened hearts.
Yeah.
Right? So hardness of heart and doing a lot of religious activity, but not having the love of God, the love for others, the care for the poor, that is a theme, huge theme throughout the Hebrew scripture, right? So, I mean, God is saying, hey, look, there's coming a day where I'm going to take out your heart of stone. I'm going to give you a heart of flesh, and so there's all these promises about what God is going to do for, hardness of heart. But I mean, we don't have to just see that hardness of heart is there.
That's an interesting point. You're right. And the Hebrew scriptures constantly, the prophets are constantly scolding the Jewish people, or the Israelites, I should say, for their hardness of heart. But, well, two points about this. One is that we haven't really answered the question of why this hardness of heart, if it is exclusive to the Israelites, why that is. But also, I think it's important to consider whether the surrounding nations would have been any different. Like, did God choose Israel as his chosen nature because they were the most hard-hearted people on earth? Or would we think, like, if he had chosen a different nation, that they would have been any different? And also, it's important to keep in mind that the Israelites were held to a much higher legal standard than the rest of the nations, right? They were held to these
Right.
613 Levitical laws. And a lot of times when they're being scolded for the stuff, it's like, you didn't keep all the laws perfectly, so, you know, shame on you, when all of these other people in these other surrounding nature, you know, would they have done any better? So I think there's still the question of like, if it is the case that the Israelites were just naturally more hard-hearted, why is that? But also, I'm not so sure that we can infer that they are more inclined to be hard-hearted on the basis of these passages in the Hebrew Bible, because for all we know, the surrounding nations would have just been just as obstinate in the face of these commands as the Jewish people. So why, again, I'm kind of going back to the question, like why were the Jews so different than the Gentiles when it comes to accepting Jesus? It's just kind of unexpected.
And I don't think they were more hard-hearted. I think in the God's interactions with Israel, we are seeing the state of all of humanity. And so I don't think that they were more hard-hearted than any other group of people would be. But you know, through God's interactions with Israel, we do see the human problem, right? And so there was so much you said, but now I can't even remember what I wanted to say to respond. No, I just can't remember what else I wanted to say about that.
Well, okay, so you're saying that you don't think they're more hard-hearted, but I guess maybe I misunderstood your explanation for why it is that the Jews seemed less inclined to accept Jesus as the Messiah than the Gentiles. I thought
not all the Jews. We were talking about the religious leaders who rejected Jesus. And not all of the religious leaders did reject Jesus. But there were enough that rejected Jesus that, you know, they had the power to turn him over to be killed. So, I don't know what more to say about that.
All right. My understanding is it wasn't just the religious leaders, but just the Jews in general. But I want to go back to something you said a while ago that's sort of related to this. You talked about how, you know, I want to kind of try to make the case a little bit as to why the Jews saw things differently. And one of the things you mentioned was miracles. And you kind of implied, or I got the sense that you were implying, that there was a bit of hard-heartedness that explains why they didn't find those miracles compelling. And I think Mark 2 is a good example of this, where Jesus is going along and he performs an exorcism or something, and then the Jews say that he's doing this by the power of Beelzebub. And he raises this argument, which I personally I think has a lot of problems. His argument about how house divided against itself cannot stand.
I love that. Yeah.
Well, I think
I want to hear what your problem is with that, because I love that statement that Jesus made.
First, let's go to Deuteronomy 13 really quick, and I'll get into that, why I don't really think it's a good argument.
I hope we're going to get to the atonement, Chad.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess we talked about it a little bit with the Ezekiel 45, but I have a lot more to talk about with the atonement. Awesome. And I looks like we're probably not going to finish that today, but maybe another time. Okay, so let's see. If a prophet, let's start at verse 1. If a prophet, one who foretells by dreams, appears among you and announces to you a sign or wonder, if the sign or wonder spoken takes place and the prophet says, let us go follow other gods you have not known, and let us worship them, you must not listen to the words of that prophet or dreamer. The Lord your God is testing you to find out whether you love him with all your heart and with all your soul. So right here we see the fact that people who are not of God can do miracles as well. And we see this in, I think, Exodus chapter 7, where Pharaoh's magicians can turn a staff into a snake.
Right.
And so there's this question we have to grapple with, which is if people who are not of God can do miracles, then what evidential value do these miracles have when it comes to establishing somebody's authority from God? And I don't see anywhere in the New Testament where this question is really taken seriously. It seems like Jesus just assumes, not just Jesus, but the New Testament authors kind of implicitly assume that if somebody can do miracles, that they're from God. You know, there's a place in John where Jesus heals a paralytic, and he gets in this argument with the Jews, and he says to them, if this man were not from God, he could do nothing. And, you know, any Jew worth his salt, any Jew who knew the Hebrew Bible could easily refute that just by going straight to Deuteronomy 13 or Exodus 7 or any of the other places where people who are not of God can do miracles. But of course, they just insult his character, because that's how the New Testament will portray the people that the authors disagree with. But I think when we consider Mark 2 in light of Deuteronomy 13, it makes a little bit of sense why the Jews wouldn't just say, oh, here's somebody who's doing miracles, he must be from God. For one thing, it explicitly tells them that that's that people who are not of God can do miracles. But well, first I'll get your thoughts on that, and then I'll go into why the particulars about Jesus's argument about a house divided against itself, and why I think that's not a very good argument. But I think this is part of the reason I don't think it's a good argument. But what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think you're actually making a great point here, that, you know, there are other powers that can do miracles. And so, you know, we shouldn't automatically assume. But I think that there was more to Jesus's appearance and his works than just like a simple miracle. But, you know, it was also the teachings that he was doing. And I mean, look, if God shows up in the flesh, it seems like there would be a greater testimony going on there. And I think that is what Jesus is talking about when he's talking about, look, you know, all the blasphemies are going to be forgiven, even when people speak against me, but the blasphemy against the Holy Spirit is not going to be forgiven. And I think that is because the Holy Spirit is speaking directly to people. The Holy Spirit is testifying to people about who Christ is. So I do think it is more than just the miracles. But
okay, so you said you think it's more than the miracles, it's also his teachings. But it seems to me when I read the Gospels that what is establishing the authority of his teachings are the miracles. And I think one of the clearest examples of that is in Mark chapter 1, verse 27. It says, the people were all so amazed that they asked each other, what is this? A new teaching, and with authority, he even gives orders to impure spirits, and they obey him. Right. So here, these people are clearly inferring on the basis of his exorcisms that he has authority, and so his teachings are not like self-validating. It's the miracles that are supposedly validating his teachings. And we see again here in Mark chapter 2, another clear example, verse 10. Jesus says, but I want you to know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. So he said to the man, I tell you, get up, take your mat, and go home. So here he's using his miracles as a way of establishing his authority. Now, the question is, what's to stop somebody somebody who's not of God, who has the power to do miracles, from leading people astray by this very means of doing miracles? And then people will say, oh, well, this person, you know, his teachings must have authority because he's doing these miracles like casting out demons. Now, Jesus attempts to give an argument against that in what was it, Mark 2, Mark 4.
Okay.
About the chapter where he gives this argument about how a house divided against itself.
Yeah, it's Mark 3.
Oh, Mark 3. Okay. Let me fill it. So he says a house divided against itself cannot stand. Now, how do we know, first of all, that a person casting out a demon by the power of Satan would entail that the house is divided against itself? You know, in the book of Acts, we see people who are selling their homes, their places of dwelling for the church. They're going to great lengths and making great sacrifices for Jesus and for their beliefs. and we wouldn't look at that and say, well, that's a house divided against itself because these people are giving up their homes, right? So what's the relevant difference here in the case of a demon who gives up its place of dwelling for the sake of Satan or Beelzebub, right? It seems like it's resting on this assumption that in order for somebody to cast out a demon by the power of Satan, that would entail some sort of conflict, when in reality, it seems like, well, for all we know, the demon and Beelzebub could be working together for the very purpose of deceiving people. And wouldn't that be a great way to do it? I mean, we read in, I think, First Thessalonians, right? It talks about the lawless one will be in accordance with how Satan works, and he'll do amazing signs and wonders to deceive people. This seems perfectly consistent with what we would expect from somebody as deceptive as Satan. And yet Jesus is kind of just saying, well, no, he couldn't do that because a house divided against itself cannot stand. Well, I mean, first of all, Satan's dominion is going to be crushed either way, right? At some point in the future. So, sorry, I've gone on for a long time. I'll get your thoughts on what I've said so far.
No, so far you're making a good point. So, but the part I really love is the next part. So,
okay.
Do you have something you want to say about that? Because
what part? The part about the unforgivable sin.
No, that in fact, no one can enter a strong man's house without first tying him up. Then he can plunder the strong man's house. So,
yeah, I mean, it's like I imagine somebody imagine somebody's investigation for insurance fraud. Their store gets broken into and taken. And he says, well, nobody can enter a strong man's house unless he binds him up, when really they were working together, saying, hey, come take all my stuff, and then you see where I'm going with this? Like there's this tacit assumption here that there would have to be this conflict between the strong man and the person who's entering their house, when there really wouldn't be. Why would we assume that?
Yeah, well, what Jesus is describing here is that he's the one who has tied up the strong man. So he is plundering the house.
I get really a different idea of what he's saying here. My impression is that, like, he's saying the demon, it's the demon and Beelzebub, one of them is the strong man, and he's saying, like, casting out a demon is kind of like doing a disservice to the demon the way that, binding up a strong man. In other words, the point is that they have to be at odds with each other. That's how I understand it, and that makes sense with what he's saying about how a house divided against itself cannot stand. That your interpretation about the strong man, you said the strong man is Jesus, or Jesus is the other person?
Jesus is the one tying up the strong man and plundering his house.
Well, so I guess I'm not seeing how that really fits with the context all that well.
Well,
because it's talking about a house divided against itself. I don't know. Sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think he's kind of making 2 points there. Like, he's kind of saying, like, basically, no one can just, cast out Satan. Like, basically, you can't just go into a man's house, unless you tie up the strong man. And that is what Jesus Christ is doing. So he's basically saying, like, he's plundering, Satan's house. And so I think it's kind of 2 separate points. But
I guess the main question here is, well, first, would somebody need to be hard-hearted in order to look at a miracle like this and think and not be convinced that this is the work of God or the work of the Messiah? Is that a necessary explanation for why somebody would reject that?
I don't know. Like I said, I think you've made some good points. Like, I think you've made a case from Deuteronomy, and I think that's a good case that you brought up that scripture and the other miracles that have been done that are not from God. And, I think there are, supernatural events happening today that are not from God.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, it does take discernment, and so that's the best answer I can give. But I don't necessarily think that, that's the full contributing thing to, like people are necessarily hard-hearted simply because they didn't believe a miracle.
I mean, my position is I think it would explain, assuming Jesus did do these miracles, which I don't believe he did, but if he did, it would kind of explain why the Jews didn't find that as compelling as the rest of the nation, because the Jews have their texts, which give them this information that the other people wouldn't have been aware of. So that's why I'm kind of thinking, we going back like 30, 40 minutes, we were talking about this question, is it hard-heartedness, or is it the Hebrew Bible that explains why the Jews, for the most part, didn't really seem to accept Jesus? And then you provided some clarification that you think it's really the religious leaders primarily who didn't accept Jesus. But I look at things like this, and it kind of makes sense from the perspective that it really is the things written in the Hebrew Bible that play an explanatory role here. When I look at the prophecies in the Bible, in the Hebrew Bible about the Messiah that are most clear, the ones that you could determine are messianic prophecies beforehand without, doing this whole retroactive interpretation thing that we see in the New Testament. What I see time and time again is that you don't have to look very far to see a description of what the world will look like when this figure comes. And it doesn't in any way seem to fit with the first century or any time since. Passages like Isaiah 11, one of the clearest passages about the Messiah. It talks about how the knowledge of God will cover the earth as the waters cover the sea. That just, you might find a way to interpret that as being true today or being true back in the first century. But I think it's pretty clear that that's, especially when you take it within the broader context of the Tanakh, that it's talking about a time in which literally everybody knows God. And there's this kind of peace and harmony in the world. The lion will lie down with the goat. It's every single time I find a clear prediction or prophecy about the Messiah in the Bible, there's something in close proximity to it that doesn't fit the time of Jesus or even any time since. And that makes me think, well, if I were looking at it from a Jewish perspective of somebody who actually believes the Hebrew Bible, that would really lead me to believe Messiah is yet to come, And so I kind of see where they're coming from in rejecting the Messiah, but I also see where Christians are coming from too, because Jesus is constantly, attributing their lack of belief to hard-heartedness and things like that. So, well,
the way that I think of that, and that particular prophecy is, there is a partial fulfillment right now of, Christ's coming, but when he returns again is where we will actually see the fulfillment. And, even Jesus, when he took the scroll of Isaiah and he spoke about himself, and he said, today, this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing. And basically, and I'm trying to see which, so Jesus actually cut it off. He didn't finish the passage. He read up to, he said he was here to release the, bind up the brokenhearted, proclaim freedom for the captives, release from darkness for the prisoners, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. Now, the very next line is, and the day of vengeance of our God. But Jesus didn't even finish the sentence. He stopped in mid-sentence because it wasn't the day of vengeance of our God. So, that's how I understand
very much
that.
of what we see in Zechariah's prophecy of him riding in on a donkey. If you read just the very next verse, talks about him speaking peace to the nations and the war horses being, done away with and all that. So there's a common, and it's understandable why the authors would do that and why Jesus would do that. Interestingly, in that passage in Luke 4, he's actually not quoting a single. This might be a little bit off topic, but he's actually quoting two different passages. He's amalgamating two different passages from Isaiah there. One is from Isaiah 61. The other, I think, is Isaiah 50 something. And the curious thing about that is that it says that he went into the synagogue and opened up the Isaiah scroll. But there's no place in the Isaiah scroll where you would read that particular amalgamation of those two verses, which that's kind of just one of those little things where I have to look at that and think this couldn't, the author of Luke has to be tweaking this a little bit, because clearly he couldn't have said what he's reported to have said. Really quick, if you want to interact with the chat, I have to go to the restroom really quick, and then maybe we can talk about the atonement before.
Okay. Yeah, sure. Go for it. Okay. And I just wanted to look that up while he's in the bathroom, because I actually don't see that it is a combination of two verses. So I will talk to him about that when he comes back. But thanks for being here, guys. Hi, Jamie. Hi, John B. Hi, Gray. Let's see. Let's see what quotes I want to put up. Hey, Heaven Bound. Let's see if anybody put any questions or anything. Let's see. A lot of chat. Thank you, guys. Okay, Gray says, who tied up the strong man? I've heard 100 different versions as well. This is the problem with the interpretation and the over 1,000 different denominations of Christianity. Well, Jesus tied up the strong man. And if you notice, actually, hi, Peter, glad you're here. Oh, Natalie's here. Cool. Thanks for watching, guys. That's actually one of the, where is it? Sorry, I lost my train of thought. Anyway, okay, well, we're back. Chad, I just looked while you were gone to see that quote from Jesus, which it doesn't seem to be a combination of two verses. It seems to all be from Isaiah 61. It's basically just, oh, wait, okay, I see what you're talking about now. Because he mentions the recovery of sight for the blind.
Yeah, if you have certain annotated Bibles will cite two verses. Other annotated Bibles will cite one, but scholars like very well-respected scholars, like Christian scholars like Dr. Michael Heiser, have pointed this out on that passage in Luke 4. Though it is easy to miss. Like I wouldn't have known it if somebody hadn't pointed it out, because I've gone back and very closely compared that verse in Isaiah 61 to what's written in. It seems like it's actually taken from the Septuagint. Which is all the more reason to be kind of, I mean, obviously the Septuagint is not the same as the Hebrew. So, but yeah, I mean, it's not a huge deal. I think the most likely explanation is the author of Luke he wanted to draw the reader's attention to both of these passages in Isaiah. And so he might have been taking some, I guess, liberties with the story a little bit, which is not, which is characteristic of the genre in which he was writing.
Right.
So, okay, but so do you want to talk a little bit about the atonement before?
Yeah.
Okay, so I have a question about when Paul says that the penalty for sin is death. What did he mean exactly by death? Did he mean like an eternal death, an eternal separation from God? Did he mean just a physical death? Was it temporary? How do you understand that word death there?
I understand it as physical death, but a complete physical, like, body and soul, like, if you're a dualist, body and soul, but, yeah.
And do you think that it was meant to be eternal? Like the penalty for sin is eternal death, or is it the penalty for sin temporary death?
Well, I would say that man is mortal, and, we are mortal, like the wages of sin is death. We are heading toward death because of our sin, and Jesus is offering immortality. So, That's how I understand it.
But when it says the wages of sin is death, it doesn't mean the wages of sin is like you die for a couple days and then come back, right? He means the wages of sin, and you probably see where I'm going with this.
Yeah.
But like, he means the wages of sin is eternal death. And so the idea is, and I know you don't take the atonement view that Jesus died as a punishment, or that God punished Jesus on the cross.
Right.
But it seems to me that if he is taking what we would have received as a, I don't know, what's penalty? No, maybe what word would you use there?
Well, as a natural consequence, right?
Okay. Yeah,
right,
if he's
like,
taking the natural, what we would have received as a natural consequence,
right,
then that should have been an eternal consequence. And if it wasn't an eternal consequence, then it seems like we could have all just paid the penalty, or paid the consequence for sin with a temporary death of the body, right? So I'm just curious. I'm sure there's some way out of there. There's some response to this. I'm just not sure what it is.
Well, the way that I understand it is that Jesus shared in our destiny so that we can share in his. So he experienced death. He tasted death in the same way that we will taste death, right? But he overcame death. So he's freely offering a new life. And so, if Jesus wasn't the Son of God, if he wasn't immortal, then, his death would have gone on forever. But, because of who he was, death had no hold on him. So, he overcame it, and he overcame it for all of us. And now he's inviting us to share in his destiny, his immortality, and that's freely offered to all.
But what you're suggesting, it seems to me, is that the fact that he resurrected after 3 days didn't do anything to nullify the atonement that he made. But wouldn't it, like in any other case, I mean, let's go back to the old covenant system. Somebody sacrifices their only goat, and
right,
they resurrected after a couple days. Doesn't that kind of nullify the sacrifice? And if not, then couldn't we? What would be the problem in us all paying the wages of sin through our own death, and then God just resurrecting us? Because then we could say we paid the wages for sin. We all died. What's left unpaid? If there's something left unpaid in that scenario, why is there not something left unpaid in the scenario where Jesus is resurrected after 3 days?
Yeah, well, I mean, I feel like there's something wrong. Like the place where there's a problem is like your understanding, or, this idea that, we could just like pay it, because it's not like, I don't see it that way. Like, I see the atonement as primarily a healing, right? So if you could heal yourself of your corruption, okay, no problem. But, the problem with us is that we became corrupt. And so we needed a healing. We needed a healer from that corruption. And we were not capable of doing that ourselves.
Well, have we actually been healed? I mean, have Christians actually been healed in that sense? Because it seems like atonement is kind of like a relational property. It's a property that exists as a relation between God and the person, as opposed to a change in the person themselves. Like when somebody has their sins atoned for, you wouldn't say that person is made perfect, would you?
I would.
Even though they're continuing to sin.
Yeah, well, I would say
somebody can be perfect and sinful at the same time.
Well, Jesus, I mean, it says in Hebrews that by one sacrifice, he made perfect those who are being made holy. So in that one verse, we understand that by his sacrifice, we're made perfect. But in some way, right now, we are continuing to be made holy.
Yeah. So then we can kind of like, whether somebody is sinful or not is kind of like of secondary consideration when it comes to whether they're perfect or not, or made right with God. So going back to this idea of somebody dying, right, without, let's say, without an atoning sacrifice, I guess I'm not understanding what it is that's left unpaid. If somebody dies for their sin, they pay the wages of sin. Maybe I'm misunderstanding Romans 6:23 when it says the wages of sin is death. It suggests to me that that is what needs to be paid in order for that person to be made right with God. And it sounds like you're saying there's something extra that beyond one's own death. What is it about? Like, why couldn't one's own death suffice? I'm not really understanding that.
Yeah, and I think that, like, I do think this is part of the issue of what does the atonement really mean, right? Like, what is happening at the atonement? Is it that the price is being paid? And there are a few places that describe the atonement as, in Greek it's lutron, which can mean price or ransom. So sometimes it is like a ransom, but so I can only tell you that it says that, but I still think there's kind of like this misunderstanding, like with the idea that, like, okay, well, I owe a debt and therefore I'm paying off a debt. I just don't see that as the way to understand the atonement in the New Testament. And so, like I said, I went through the entire New Testament. I wrote down everything it says about the atonement, and I really don't see that there as if it's like this, okay, I owe God this debt and therefore I'm paying it. And I also don't see it as Jesus taking a punishment, because that's just not what it says. So the things that it says about the atonement is that it saved us from our sins. It's for the forgiveness of sins. It's, rescuing us from the present evil age. We have victory through it so that we could receive the full rights of sons. I mean, there's a whole list of things that it says the atonement is accomplishing. And so I don't think that it is something that, we could easily say, oh yeah, we can accomplish this ourselves, because, the problem is that we were not able to accomplish it ourselves, which is why God came in the flesh.
I mean, I understand when you talk about what it accomplished, but what I guess I don't really understand is how you can say that it's necessary for our salvation without putting forth some sort of kind of atonement framework, which says that there's a debt that needs to be paid, or at least something similar to that. And I'm not hearing, like, if that's not how it works, then what is the alternative, like, framework that in virtue of which we need this sacrifice?
I would call it a healing of humanity, a healing of what was wrong, a restoration of humanity, a reversal of the disobedience of mankind. One man was disobedient and brought sin and death into the world. One man reversed it through his obedience.
Okay, well, maybe that's the closest I'll get to an understanding here and now. Okay, let me go into a different question related to the atonement. So if somebody under the old covenant sacrificial system had all of their sins atoned for and forgiven through the old covenant system, and then they die without committing any other sins, would they need the blood of Jesus to be saved? And if so, why?
Yeah, well, I mean, in Hebrews, it says that the blood of bulls and goats actually did not provide what was necessary. Now, so, of course, I agree that in the Old Testament, this is what was said to do to atone for the sins. And I see that as a picture of what Christ would do. So it was an act of obedience that revealed the future sacrifice that actually would take away sins. So the way that I understand it is that everyone before Christ, every person who will be saved is being saved through what Christ did, that his sacrifice was necessary.
So, yeah, and I've thought about this passage in Hebrews 10 a lot, right? It says the blood of bulls and goats can never take away sin. And I've explored different interpretations of that, but I think any interpretation one takes should ideally at least be compatible with what we read in the Old Testament. So, for example, Leviticus 5, verse 10 says, the priest shall then offer the other as a burnt offering in the prescribed way and make atonement for them for the sin they have committed, and they will be forgiven. So we see here both the atonement and forgiveness can be made through this process. And it looks to me like what Christians are forced to do in order to reconcile this with Hebrews 10 is they say, well, it doesn't really mean that their sins are forgiven. And even though, if you're reading this within its ancient historical context, you would obviously think this is saying that somebody's sins are atoned for and forgiven through this sacrifice, through this process in which the burnt offering is made with the priest. But really, that's not really what's going on. Really, it's this future sacrifice of Jesus. But don't you think that's kind of like, is that really being honest with what is written here in Leviticus 5? Or doesn't it kind of seem like at that point you're just trying to make the text fit what it would need to mean for Christianity to be true? Because how would you understand if you were living prior to the New Testament, right? How would you understand this passage in Leviticus 5 that I just read? Would you?
Yeah, I'd be like, hey, I'm good with God. I brought my sacrifice. Hey, it's all covered now, and so I do understand it as, I think of it as this: those offerings that were made were offerings of obedience. And they were God saw that as sufficient as a temporary measure, right? And we kind of see that in Hebrews where it talks about, if those sacrifices were enough, then the priests wouldn't have had to keep coming year after year to offer. So the temporary sacrifices that were being offered were sufficient as a temporary measure for the forgiveness of sins, but it was not sufficient for the healing of humanity that needed to happen. We needed something that would not just be this covering over, but that would be transformative of who we are. And that is one thing that is said about the atonement, is that this is actually made us holy. It's purified us. And that we are actually new. We are new creations. So I think there was something that was happening that was real, but it was a temporary measure until the fullness of time had come and we could be fully healed from, the corruption.
I can understand saying it's temporary in the sense that from your perspective, the old covenant system wasn't meant to be a permanent solution for sin. But if what you mean when you say it's temporary is that it left something undone to which one wasn't truly made right with God, I'm curious to know what that is, because it says here, the priest will make atonement and they will be forgiven. I mean, if it really means what it says there, then the person is forgiven, and you can't just say, well, they're forgiven, but they're not really made right with God yet. Because
did I say they weren't made right with God? No. Did I say God didn't forgive them?
No, but if you're going to acknowledge that they are forgiven, and then I'm still left wondering what it is that person would need the blood of Christ for. Because if they've had their sins atoned for and forgiven, then there's nothing left for Jesus's atonement to make. So it sounds like you're implicit. I agree. You're not explicitly saying that there's that they're left unforgiven. But it sounds like you're implicitly saying it, because you're saying on the one hand that they had their sins atoned for and forgiven, but at the same time, you're saying that they needed the blood of Christ to be saved, which seems to imply that that their sins weren't really atoned for and forgiven through this process. Now, what I understand in Hebrews, what Hebrews is saying is that one of the differences between this old covenant system and the new covenant system is that with the old covenant system, you have to keep bringing back sacrifices over and over and over again. Right. And so if somebody, you sin, you bring your goat as a sin offering, you might be made right for a little while, but only until you sin again. Right. Only until you sin again. And then you need another sacrifice. And if you sin and then you're on your way to the temple and you die before making that sacrifice, then I could understand maybe from the Christian perspective saying, well, that's where the blood of Christ comes in, because that person wasn't able to make atonement. And I could understand certainly from the perspective of convenience, saying like it's a far more convenient solution to sin with what Jesus did on the cross, because we don't have to constantly be going back to the temple. But it seems like you're making a stronger claim here, and you're saying, no, these people, even though they had their sins atoned for and forgiven through the system, that they need the blood of Christ anyway. And I'm left wondering, well, what is left unpaid? What is it that they need the blood of Christ for?
Well, let's compare it to someone who has a contagious disease, right? Like, let's consider the atoning sacrifice is sort of like putting them in a hazmat suit, right? Like you stopped the spread of the disease, but what really needs to happen is that the whole person needs to be healed, so they don't even need the hazmat suit, right? So, and I mean, maybe that's an on the spot analogy. It may fall apart, but
healing. Sorry to interrupt, but just to be clear, when you say healing, I understand that as just meaning having their sins atoned for and forgiven. If there's something else you mean by healing, then I need to know what that is.
Yeah, and I do think there's a distinction, because I do think, yes, Jesus died for the forgiveness of sins, but he also did more than that. It says that God condemned sin in sinful man, and that we might. And no, wait, that's not the verse I want. Hold on. Jesus became sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God. So, like in Jesus Christ and what he's done, we are receiving a purification, a total, it's not just a forgiveness, but it's a healing of the disease. So, it's like, okay, it's like, if you think about sin as a disease that all of us are infected with, right? And then you think about the Levitical sacrifices as a treatment, to temporarily take care of the disease. But really what needs to happen is the whole disease needs to be cured. And so what is happening with Christ is that humanity is being fully restored to what God intended in the first place, that we would no longer be beings that would need to fight against this corruption that's within us. That we would no longer be in that state where we would have to try to be good, that we would have to attempt to obey God, but that we would be fully healed and restored back to the image of God that he created.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I think is happening with Christ. And that's not happening with the Levitical sacrifice. God is forgiving, but it's not a permanent restoration.
But this is the thing, is I don't see why a permanent restoration would be necessary. Remember, I put forth a very specific circumstance in which somebody has their sins atoned for, through the old covenant sacrificial system, and then they die. So there's no future sins that this person needs to have atoned for, right? And so what I understand is the difference between the new and old covenant sacrificial system is, with the new, you don't have to keep. It's more of a cure. Just to use your disease analogy, it's more of a cure than a remedy, in the sense that a a remedy you have to keep doing, and the cure is like you don't have to keep administering it. But what would somebody, if somebody, I guess I think using
Okay.
analogies and
Yeah.
did something click or
Yeah, I think I have a way of explaining it, and I can't take credit for this. This is Watchman Nee. But think of it as a race of people, right? That in Adam all die. And this isn't just Watchman Nee, it's also, of course, from the New Testament, but probably 1 Corinthians 15, or I don't remember exactly where this is, but basically, think of Jesus as the head of a new race of human. We were all born of Adam, right? And basically Adam's race was all heading toward death. And so God may have forgiven that person, through the Levitical sacrifices, but that person still needs to become part of the race of the second man, the Jesus Christ, who is the obedient man. So it's becoming part of a different race of people, and one that is immortal.
I think that sometimes using analogies like this or analogous language like this can sometimes mask the particular point of disagreement, or the particular issue that's like, I understand what you're saying to an extent, but I guess the specific question I'm looking for an answer to is like, when if somebody had their sins atoned for, what is it that the blood of Christ, that Jesus's atonement is, what sins do they need atoned for? And if there is no answer to that question, then I'm not understanding why that person can't be part of the new race that you're talking about, or just be cured. I'm not understanding that part, but I don't know if I'll think about what you said, and maybe it'll come to me, or maybe I'll have some further insight on this, but it's looks like we're at an hour and a half. So I've really enjoyed the conversation.
Me too, Chad. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for being here. And I hope we can talk again.